The house stood at the edge of the forest, an imposing structure of weathered stone and dark wood, its tall windows framed by creeping ivy and moss that clung to the stone walls. To the casual observer, it was the picture of tranquility, an isolated home removed from the bustle of the city. There were no neighbors for miles, just the trees and the winding road that led back to the small town a few hours away. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the noise of the world outside didn't penetrate. Inside, the atmosphere was similarly calm. The house, though large, was sparsely furnished, each room methodically arranged with an air of restrained elegance. The smell of fresh pine and old leather filled the space. In the kitchen, sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the polished countertops and the heavy oak table where most of their meals were shared. On the surface, it seemed like the ideal home for a family seeking peace and solitude. Lena, the wife, moved through the house with quiet grace. She had always been a woman of few words, her beauty understated but unmistakable, delicate features framed by chestnut brown hair that cascaded down her back. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as though she was careful not to disturb the fragile calm that surrounded her. She was in her early 30s, though her face often betrayed the weariness of someone far older. The weight of something unspoken, something unresolved, seemed to linger just beneath her skin. Her husband, Adam, was a man of contradictions. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that rarely seemed to look anyone directly in the face. He had a charm that could win people over, though he rarely used it. Most of the time, his gaze seemed distant, as though his mind was always elsewhere, occupied with thoughts far beyond the boundaries of their home. When he was present, his silence felt heavy. He had built a life for them, a comfortable life, but there was something about the way he carried himself that always made Lena feel as though she were an afterthought in his existence. Their love had once felt like an all-consuming fire, but it had slowly dimmed, leaving only embers behind. The third member of their household, Sophie, was a long-time friend who had become like family over the years. In her late 20s, Sophie was strikingly beautiful, with a bold, carefree spirit that contrasted sharply with Lena's more reserved nature. She had moved in with them after a difficult breakup, and her presence in the house had started to become less of a temporary arrangement and more of a fixture. She was someone who laughed easily and spoke her mind, filling the house with a sense of lightness that Lena had come to appreciate in a way that she couldn't quite explain. However, there were times when Lena found herself questioning the closeness between Sophie and Adam, though she couldn't pinpoint any exact reason for her discomfort. Sophie was always friendly, always open, but something about her presence, the way she lingered in rooms with Adam just a bit too often, made Lena uneasy. They all had their roles in this quiet, isolated existence, yet beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives, tensions were beginning to brew. Every morning, Lena and Adam followed the same routine. He would wake early, leave the house for a few hours to attend to his business, and return just in time for dinner. He would never say much about what he did during the day, only offering vague answers when Lena inquired. His work had always been a mystery to her, but she had long since stopped asking questions. She knew he would either lie or avoid giving her a straight answer, so she simply stopped seeking the truth. Lena, on the other hand, spent her days tending to the house, garden, and occasional errands in the town. She wasn't idle, but the monotony of the task seemed to seep into her very bones, dulling her sense of purpose. She had once been an artist, her paintings filled with vivid colors and wild strokes, but over time, her art had been swallowed by the quiet demands of domestic life. Sophie, ever the free spirit, was the one who injected a sense of energy into the home. Her laughter echoed through the halls, and her tendency to engage with Adam over casual topics often kept the atmosphere from becoming too stifling. Lena had never questioned the closeness they shared. Sophie was like a sister to her, but there were moments when she caught herself staring at them, noting the way their gazes would linger just a moment too long, the way Sophie would lean in a bit too close when talking to Adam. It was nothing overtly suggestive, nothing that could be considered improper, but it unsettled her. Still, the days passed in a haze of routine, each one blending into the next. The outside world didn't seem to matter. One evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, Lena sat at the table, pushing her food around her plate. Adam was absent-mindedly flipping through a stack of papers, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Sophie leaned back in her chair, feet propped up on the edge of the table. Lena's gaze flickered between the two of them. She didn't know what it was, but something about the way they were positioned, Sophie's legs loosely crossed, Adam leaning toward her slightly as he listened to her talk, felt wrong. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it gnawed at Lena. Her own gaze dropped to the table, to the edge of the wood that was worn smooth from years of use. There was something suffocating about the stillness in the air, about the lack of true connection between her and Adam. She had tried, so many times, to rekindle what they had once shared, but it had always felt like she was reaching for something that was slipping away from her grasp. Sophie's voice cut through the silence. "So, what are your plans for the weekend?" Lena looked up, startled by the sudden question. Adam's response was non-committal, his attention still focused on the papers in front of him. Sophie, however, was looking at him with a smile that was too bright, too knowing. For a brief moment, Lena felt a pang of jealousy, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't as though there was anything to worry about. They were just friends, after all. But that feeling, so fleeting, so insidious, lingered in the back of her mind. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Lena sat in the dimly lit living room, the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. Adam had retreated to his study, and she could hear the faint rustle of papers as he worked late into the night. She didn't want to be suspicious. She didn't want to believe that anything was amiss. But there was a growing sense of unease within her, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of their home that she couldn't ignore. It was in the way Adam's touch had become lighter, almost absent, when he passed by her. It was in the way he looked at Sophie, with an intensity that wasn't entirely innocent. It was in the way the space between them seemed to widen, even when they were standing in the same room. And then, that night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard the unmistakable sound of a soft laugh, the kind that wasn't meant for her, coming from the study. She held her breath, her heart racing in her chest. The clock ticked louder. The world outside seemed to disappear. And she knew, deep down, that something had shifted. The betrayal had already begun, though she hadn't yet fully realized it. But she would soon. The mornings had become colder, and with them came an even colder silence that hung between Lena and Adam. It wasn't something she could articulate, nor did she want to, but the absence of conversation felt heavier each day. Each meal they shared, each glance exchanged, carried an invisible weight. Adam's early mornings and late nights had become the norm, and Lena began to wonder when she'd last had a real conversation with him, one that wasn't filled with empty pleasantries or surface-level inquiries. The subtle shifts she had noticed before had evolved into a pattern. He was always distracted. The quiet hum of his phone in the other room, his whispered conversations with Sophie when Lena wasn't around, little things that never amounted to anything, yet always felt like something to Lena. They didn't speak of it openly, but they didn't have to. She could sense the distance between them, growing wider with each passing day, like a rift she couldn't bridge. Sophie, for her part, had not changed. She was ever the same carefree presence, offering laughs and light-hearted conversation. She was always quick to engage with Lena, making sure to fill the silence with her spirited chatter. But Lena noticed the way Sophie looked at Adam when she thought Lena wasn't paying attention. Sophie didn't stare outright, but there were fleeting moments, glances too quick for Lena to fully catch, but enough for her to feel unsettled. At first, Lena tried to dismiss it as nothing, just her overactive imagination, perhaps. But deep down, a nagging feeling grew stronger with each passing day. The fact that Sophie had stayed with them all this time, the fact that Adam seemed more drawn to her than ever before, the way she often seemed to be the one keeping him entertained during their solitary evenings, all of it began to feel like more than coincidence. One evening, after a long day of quiet work around the house, Lena sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, the orange and pink hues painting the sky. She used to find solace in these moments, a chance to breathe and reset before the chaos of the next day. But today, the stillness felt suffocating, like the very air around her was holding its breath. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Sophie approaching. The younger woman smiled, but there was something forced about it, something calculated. "You all right?" Sophie asked, sitting beside her on the weathered rocking chair. Her voice was light, but there was an underlying tension Lena hadn't missed. Lena nodded, offering a tight smile. "Just tired, I suppose." Sophie looked at her, her gaze lingering longer than usual, her eyes almost searching. "It's a beautiful evening. You should relax a bit, enjoy it." Lena wasn't sure what to make of the statement. Sophie, always the optimist, had a way of turning every situation into something light-hearted, but this time there was an edge to her words. Something about the way she said it, as though Lena's peace of mind was something Sophie herself had a stake in. "I will," Lena replied, though her voice lacked conviction. There was a long pause, and then Sophie shifted uncomfortably. "You know, Adam's been a little distant lately. I don't know if you've noticed. He's been working so hard." Lena stiffened at the mention of Adam's name, her gaze turning to the ground. Her heart quickened, though she didn't know why. She wasn't ready for this conversation. Not yet. But Sophie, seemingly oblivious to Lena's discomfort, continued, "I'm sure it's just work. He's been under a lot of pressure, you know?" Lena's hand gripped the armrest of the chair. Sophie's words felt too pointed, too intentional. Was this sympathy? Or something else? Something more calculated? "I'm sure," Lena said, her voice betraying a hint of tension. Sophie's gaze softened, but there was something unreadable behind her eyes. She stood up, brushing off her skirt. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." Lena nodded, but the words felt hollow, the gesture meaningless. Sophie's smile seemed to flicker for a moment before it settled back into place, and she walked away, leaving Lena alone with her thoughts. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Adam arrived late as usual, his face tight, his eyes dark from exhaustion. He didn't acknowledge Lena's presence immediately, instead retreating to the study without so much as a glance in her direction. Lena watched him go, her heart sinking into her chest. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong. Something had shifted, and she had no idea how to fix it. The next few days followed the same routine. Lena tried to keep herself busy organizing bookshelves, cleaning the house, tending to the garden, but the quiet tension was always there, lurking. Every time Adam left for work, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really going anywhere. That his absence was part of something bigger, something she couldn't see yet. And then, the first crack appeared. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, when Lena was in the kitchen preparing a light lunch. She had heard Sophie's voice outside the window, a soft, teasing laugh mixed with Adam's low tone. It was nothing out of the ordinary, or so she thought. But when Sophie entered the house, there was a strange quiet about her. Her usual cheer had dimmed, replaced by a noticeable tension that was impossible to ignore. Sophie approached Lena in the kitchen, her face flushed, her eyes darting away from Lena's. I'm sorry," she said, her voice strained. "I shouldn't have." Lena froze, the knife she was holding slipping from her hand onto the counter. "What is it?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, her hands wringing in front of her. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she muttered, more to herself than to Lena. "But I think you should know something's going on with Adam and me." Lena's breath caught in her throat, the room suddenly spinning. The words didn't register immediately. She blinked, trying to process what Sophie had just said, but all she could hear was the ringing silence that followed. Sophie's eyes were wide now, filled with a mix of guilt and fear. "I never wanted to hurt you, Lena. But I think you need to know. Adam, he's been keeping things from you. And I can't pretend anymore." The kitchen felt suffocating as Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Her legs felt weak, and she had to lean against the counter to steady herself. Sophie's confession echoed in her mind, each word twisting deeper into her gut. She could barely breathe. But before Lena could respond, Sophie turned and fled the room, leaving Lena standing there alone, her world collapsing in on itself. Later that night, Adam returned, his footsteps heavy in the hallway. Lena was waiting for him, the words she had rehearsed in her mind falling to pieces as he walked into the living room. He looked at her with the same detached indifference that had marked him for weeks now. She stood up, her hands trembling at her sides. "What did Sophie mean, Adam?" His expression faltered, but only for a moment. "It's nothing, Lena. Just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Lena's voice shook. "Don't lie to me." "She told me everything." Adam's gaze hardened, his jaw clenching. "It's not what you think." "It's..." "Then what is it?" Lena demanded, her voice rising, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What have you been hiding from me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his back on her, a gesture that spoke louder than anything he could say. Lena's chest tightened, the realization settling over her like a storm. The betrayal wasn't just in Sophie's words, it was in Adam's silence. In the cold distance he had created between them. The days that followed Sophie's confession were marked by an eerie stillness in the house. Lena tried to ignore the gnawing dread in her chest, but it clung to her every step, every breath. The words Sophie had spoken echoed through her mind like a constant refrain, each repetition making them harder to ignore. It was impossible to pretend anymore. Lena was no longer certain about anything. What had once been a predictable routine had unraveled, and she was left in a state of perpetual uncertainty, her mind racing for answers. She couldn't just sit back and wait for Adam to tell her the truth if, indeed, there was any truth left to find. Adam, for his part, had become even more distant. The few times they did interact, he seemed increasingly annoyed by her presence, brushing her off with curt responses. He no longer made eye contact, as if avoiding her gaze would somehow erase the growing rift between them. And Sophie, who had been almost a constant companion to Lena in the past, now seemed more like a shadow lurking in the corners of their home. Every time Lena caught sight of her, she was either avoiding Lena's gaze or giving her a look filled with unspoken apologies. But it wasn't just their avoidance that made Lena's skin crawl, it was the way their presence together had changed. They were still occupying the same space, but it felt like they were living in different worlds, worlds that had no room for her. One evening, as Lena walked down the hall, she overheard Sophie's voice, soft, low, intimate, coming from the study. The door was ajar, and though Lena hesitated, she couldn't resist. She paused just outside, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the crack, she could see Sophie and Adam seated across from each other, their faces close, too close. Adam was speaking in a voice she couldn't hear, but his posture, his body language, it was all too familiar, too personal. Sophie was leaning in, listening with a look of understanding that seemed far more than friendly. The warmth between them was palpable, and Lena felt a cold knot twist inside her. It only lasted for a few moments before Sophie noticed Lena's presence, her eyes flickering to the doorway. She stiffened, and in that instant, Adam turned, his expression unreadable. The moment hung between them, and for a heartbeat, Lena thought the world might shatter in that fragile silence. Sophie was the first to speak, breaking the tension. "Lena," she started, but her voice trailed off as she looked at Adam, then back at Lena. I didn't mean for you to find out like this." Lena's chest tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. The weight of the words Sophie had spoken earlier came crashing back in full force. "How long, Adam?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow more forceful than she intended. Adam didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, as though trying to decide whether to lie or tell the truth. And in that moment, Lena realized something she hadn't quite understood before: he wasn't just avoiding her. He had already made a decision. And that decision had nothing to do with her. "I didn't want this," Adam finally said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But you weren't enough for me anymore." The words hit Lena like a slap. She blinked, trying to process the cold finality in his tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was apathy. Sophie's face flushed, her eyes flickering with guilt, but she didn't speak. Instead, she lowered her gaze, almost as though she were ashamed of something she had no right to be ashamed of. Lena felt the ground beneath her feet begin to tilt, the room spinning. How long? She asked again, her voice shaking. A year, Adam replied, his eyes avoiding hers. I've been with Sophie for a year. The words were like shards of glass, slicing through her skin. She staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. A year. A year of betrayal, of lies. A year that Lena had been living in the dark, pretending everything was fine when, in truth, the very foundation of her life had been crumbling. Sophie stepped forward, her expression softening with something like sorrow. Lena, I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to get this complicated. But it happened, and... Save it, Lena snapped, her voice raw. She was trembling now, but not from fear, no, this was something far worse. It was anger. It was disbelief. Just get out. Sophie's face crumpled, and she glanced at Adam, who stood motionless, his gaze still fixed on the floor. Neither of them moved for a moment, and then, without another word, Sophie turned and left the study. Lena heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, but she didn't watch her go. She couldn't. Adam remained where he was, his posture stiff, his eyes still averted. Lena, please, he began, but his words felt empty. Hollow. I never meant to hurt you. I thought you'd understand eventually. Understand? Lena's voice cracked as she took a step forward. Understand what, exactly? That you've been sleeping with my best friend for a year? That you've lied to me every single day? You thought I would understand that? Adam didn't respond. He stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for the storm to pass. But it wasn't passing. Lena could feel it, boiling inside her, rage and hurt combining in a whirlwind that threatened to tear everything apart. Do you love her? She asked, her voice low and steady. He hesitated. For the first time, he looked up at her, his eyes conflicted. I don't know. I thought I did. But I wasn't happy with you anymore, Lena. Not for a long time. The words were like knives, each one twisting deeper than the last. Lena wanted to scream. She wanted to shout at him, to tear him apart with her words, but instead, she stood there, frozen, her heart splintering into pieces. And then, in the silence that followed, Lena realized something that terrified her more than the betrayal itself. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his love. What she needed, what she had always needed, was for him to feel what she felt. To feel the weight of his actions. To understand that the damage he had done couldn't be undone by simple words. But it was already too late. The betrayal was complete, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed Adam's confession were an endless blur of silence and the suffocating weight of a broken heart. Lena could barely remember the first few hours after Adam had admitted the truth. Everything had become a fog of disbelief and betrayal. She had hoped, somewhere deep inside, that it had all been a nightmare, a cruel joke, but when she woke each morning, the harsh reality would hit her like a wave. Sophie was gone. Adam was still there, but he might as well have been a stranger. It was impossible for Lena to escape the suffocating stillness of their home. Every room felt like a tomb. Even the smallest sound seemed amplified, the tick of the clock on the wall a constant reminder of the time she had wasted, of the years spent believing in a lie. Adam had hardly spoken to her since that night, retreating to his study each day, his eyes never meeting hers. The gap between them had widened into a chasm that seemed insurmountable. Lena could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, as if the very walls were closing in on her. There was no comfort to be found in his presence. Only emptiness. Each time she looked at him, she was reminded of how far they had fallen, how much she had trusted him, how little he had valued that trust. The anger that had seethed inside her at first had dulled to a sharp, bitter ache that settled deep within her chest. She had loved him with every ounce of her being, and now all she had left were the shattered pieces of that love. What could she do with them? Could she even salvage anything at all? The question lingered in her mind, but it was more than that, it was a question of her identity. Who was she now, without him, without the life they had built together? The thought of starting over, of rebuilding from the wreckage, felt like a mountain she could never climb. The weight of the betrayal was not just in the loss of Adam, but in the loss of herself. One afternoon, after another agonizingly silent morning, Lena decided she couldn't stay cooped up in the house any longer. She couldn't keep staring at the same walls, the same furniture that had once held happy memories now stained with the ghosts of her grief. She needed air. She needed space. Lena grabbed her jacket and stepped out the door, her shoes slapping against the concrete as she walked down the quiet street. She didn't know where she was going. Maybe the park. Maybe the lake. But for the first time in days, her legs carried her without thinking, each step a rebellion against the suffocating paralysis that had taken hold of her. She walked for what felt like hours, but eventually, she found herself at the edge of a small park she and Adam had often visited. It was one of their favorite spots, a peaceful retreat where they had picnicked, talked for hours, and even argued about petty things, all of which now seemed so irrelevant in the face of what had happened. Standing there, looking at the familiar benches and the quiet pond, Lena felt something stir deep inside her, a mixture of sadness and anger, of longing and loss. But there was also a realization, a clarity that cut through the fog of confusion. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be anywhere near the memories they had made. She wanted to scream, to shake her fists at the sky and demand to know why this had happened. But instead, she stood there in silence, watching the ripples in the pond, waiting for something, anything, to offer her solace. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of someone walking along the path, a figure she recognized instantly. Sophie. For a brief moment, Lena thought about turning around, pretending she hadn't seen her. But something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. She was tired of hiding. Tired of pretending she didn't know what was happening. Sophie had been part of the betrayal too. Lena had a right to face her. Sophie stopped when she saw Lena, her expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised, but neither did she look relieved. It was as though they were both trapped in this awkward dance, unsure of how to proceed. Lena took a step forward, her voice hoarse but steady. "You can't just walk away, Sophie." Sophie's eyes flickered with something: guilt, regret, fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail her. Instead, she looked at the ground, her hands wringing together. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Lena laughed bitterly, the sound harsh against the quiet of the park. "You never meant for it? Are you serious? You've been lying to me for a year, Sophie. A year. I don't even know who you are anymore." Sophie's face tightened, the guilt in her eyes growing more pronounced. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to stop it. It just happened." Lena's anger flared up once more, a hot, vicious thing that burned through her veins. "You think that makes it okay? That it just happened? You've been playing this game behind my back for so long, and now you're sorry? You don't get to be sorry, Sophie." The words felt like they were ripping from her, the pain too much to contain. She could feel her chest tightening, a storm of emotion threatening to explode. But as much as she wanted to scream, she couldn't. Instead, she simply stood there, shaking with the intensity of her emotions, unable to look away from the woman who had once been her friend. Sophie took a step toward her, her eyes filled with anguish. "Lena, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear I didn't. I don't know how it got to this point. I never thought we would end up here." Lena looked at her, her gaze cold. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you destroyed everything. You've ruined it all." Sophie flinched, as though Lena's words physically struck her. She opened her mouth again, but Lena couldn't bear to hear any more. She turned and walked away, the weight of the conversation sinking into her chest like a stone. She didn't look back. That night, Lena sat in the dark, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of contradictions. She hated Sophie. She hated Adam. But deep down, beneath the layers of anger, there was a deeper ache that wouldn't go away. She loved them both, and now they had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Adam didn't come home that night. Lena didn't know if that was intentional or just another symptom of the unraveling life they now lived. She had long since stopped waiting for him to come back, for him to apologize, for him to explain. There was nothing left to explain. The silence between them had already spoken volumes. But the next day, Adam returned home early, his face drawn and tired. He looked like someone who had spent the entire night wrestling with his own conscience, and Lena almost felt a flicker of something resembling pity. But then she saw him, standing there in the doorway, his eyes still unwilling to meet hers. She didn't want to see him. Not anymore. "You didn't come home last night," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "You've made your choices, Adam." There's nothing left to say. Adam's eyes flickered, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something. But no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, paralyzed, waiting for Lena to do something. To tell him what to do. But Lena had nothing left to give him. "Get out," she said simply. He didn't argue. He simply turned and left, and this time, Lena didn't watch him go. Lena had not been prepared for this. Even after everything she had discovered, even after Sophie's confession and Adam's cold apathy, she still hadn't truly understood the depth of the betrayal until the days started to stretch on. The absence of Adam in the house, his avoidance of her presence, was more than just silence, it was a complete erasure. It was as though he had already left, without actually packing his bags. It was an eerie realization, one that gnawed at Lena's insides. Adam had already checked out of their marriage, and now, there was only the hollow shell of what had once been a life shared. But what was worse than the emptiness was the fact that she couldn't seem to escape it. Not even for a moment. The house felt suffocating. The very walls that had once held laughter now felt cold and unwelcoming. Lena had tried to distract herself by going to work, but even her colleagues noticed the change in her, how her eyes no longer held the same spark, how her words were often mechanical, absent of their usual enthusiasm. Her friends had stopped calling, unsure of what to say to someone whose world had been shattered. And in that silence, she began to realize the devastating truth: Adam had already left her, but now, it was her turn to leave the relationship. Only, she didn't know how. One evening, as the oppressive silence settled in once more, Lena found herself standing in front of their shared bedroom, staring at the door. It had been days since Adam had slept there, since he'd even looked at her properly. She felt as though she were an intruder in her own life. Everything had been taken from her, even the simple comfort of her own home. The door creaked open with a hesitant push, and the room, so familiar, now felt like a foreign land. The bed that they had once shared, their bodies entwined in the simplest of intimacies, now seemed so cold. The scent of Adam lingered, faint, but it was enough to make her stomach turn. She had spent years here, thinking she knew every inch of the space, every corner of their life together. But now, nothing felt like it belonged to her anymore. She reached for the nightstand, her fingers brushing against the edges of the photographs they had taken together: vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. She saw herself smiling in each one, but the faces in the pictures were strangers now, frozen in time, nothing but relics of a past that no longer held any meaning. Suddenly, she couldn't bear to be in the room any longer. She fled, stumbling into the living room, where she found herself face to face with Adam, who had somehow entered the house without her noticing. "Lena," he began, his voice low but thick with something regret, perhaps, or guilt. But it sounded forced, as if he were struggling to find the right words to make this all okay. As if the years they had spent together could be fixed with a few simple apologies. "Don't," she snapped, her voice breaking as she turned her back to him. Just don't. I'm done with the excuses, Adam. I'm done with pretending that this isn't happening. I can't do this anymore. He moved closer, but Lena recoiled instinctively. She couldn't bear for him to touch her, not now, not after everything. Lena, please, he said, his voice desperate. I know I messed up. I do. I'm sorry for everything, but I don't want your apologies. Lena cut him off, her chest tight, her hands trembling. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I want you to understand that you've destroyed everything. Everything. What you did, what you've been doing, it's not something I can just forget. I can't just go back to pretending it's all okay. I'm not that person anymore. There was a long pause, during which Adam simply stood there, staring at her, his lips parted but unsure of how to respond. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't known for months, maybe longer. Lena shook her head, the finality in her words sinking into the air between them. I don't even know who you are anymore. I don't think I ever really knew you. The words stung, and though they were not the ones Adam had hoped to hear, they were the truth. She had given him everything, had shared her soul, her vulnerabilities, her love, and in return, he had taken it all and discarded it. There was no coming back from that. I never meant to hurt you like this, Lena, he said, his voice soft now, almost pleading. I didn't want to lose you. But you already did, Lena whispered, the tears welling in her eyes despite herself. She wiped them away, frustrated with her own weakness. You lost me the moment you chose Sophie over me. You lost me the moment you started lying, pretending nothing was wrong. Adam's face twisted, as if he were finally seeing the weight of what he had done. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. I didn't choose her, he said, but it sounded like an excuse, not a truth. It wasn't like that. You don't understand. I was confused. I thought I could fix things. But he stopped himself, his voice trailing off, realizing that no amount of words would undo the destruction. Don't, Lena interjected sharply. I'm done with the excuses. I'm done with you. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. And in that moment, Lena realized she had already let him go. Her heart had already shut down, and now, she simply didn't care anymore. Not about him. Not about the life they had built. It was as if all the love had leaked out of her, leaving nothing but the raw remnants of who she used to be. There was no room for him in her life anymore. No space for the lies, the guilt, the regret. I'm leaving, Lena said, her voice steady now, despite the shaking in her hands. I can't live here anymore. I can't live with you. Adam's face paled, his eyes wide with shock. You're serious? Yes, she replied, her voice final. I'm serious. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the realization of what had just happened. The final rupture. The end of everything they had been. Adam's gaze faltered, and his shoulders slumped, but there was nothing he could do. Lena had already made up her mind. And as much as it hurt to admit it, she knew there was no turning back now. Their love had been twisted into something unrecognizable, something toxic, and there was no cure for that. Lena walked past him, her steps slow but deliberate. She could feel Adam's eyes on her, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. There was nothing left for her in this house, in this life. She was finally walking away from it all, from the man she had loved, from the future they had planned. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality, and as she stepped out into the cool evening air, Lena felt a strange sense of freedom wash over her. It wasn't the kind of freedom she had once dreamed of, but it was a freedom all the same. She was done. And in that moment, as she walked away from the ruins of her past, she realized that sometimes, the hardest thing isn't letting go, it's accepting that the person you thought you knew never really existed in the first place.